The sun was beginning to set, casting long, stretched shadows across the bustling city streets. Lyra crouched in the dim light, tucking herself close to a corner of the sidewalk. Her hands were small, dirt-caked, and cold as they reached out, palm up, toward the hurried feet of people walking by. She knew better than to look directly into the eyes of the passers-by. The sight of her made many uncomfortable, and most couldn't bear to look her way. Her voice was hoarse from asking all day, a scratchy whisper as she muttered, "Please, ma'am, just a few coins." But the few that noticed her looked down with disdain, clutching their designer bags and looking past her, as though she were nothing but a shadow among shadows. For as long as she could remember, Lyra had lived on the streets. She had grown accustomed to the chill in her bones and the persistent ache of hunger gnawing at her stomach. Her home was a folded piece of cardboard she'd found behind a store that tossed away its packaging late at night. It wasn't much, but it kept her from lying directly on the cold cement. As she looked around, her gaze settled on a woman emerging from a nearby store. The woman was elegant, draped in a deep blue silk scarf, her fingers adorned with rings that sparkled even in the fading light. Her heels clicked sharply against the pavement, each step precise, rehearsed. The woman's gaze flickered downward as she noticed Lyra, her expression curling with distaste. Lyra's stomach churned, but she pushed her pride aside, shuffling forward on bare feet toughened by the endless miles she had walked on asphalt, never knowing if the next step would lead to safety or struggle. She gently reached out, her fingertips just brushing the edge of the woman's coat. "Please, ma'am, just a little food. It's been 2 days since I ate anything proper." The woman turned abruptly, jerking her arm away as though Lyra's touch had left a stain. Her voice was sharp, filled with disdain as she hissed, "Don't you dare touch me! This coat costs more than you'll ever see in your lifetime. You little thief!" A murmur rose in Lyra's throat, but she swallowed it down, willing herself to be patient, humble, as she forced herself to ask again, "Ma'am, please, I could work, wash your car, clean up around your store, anything." The woman's face twisted in disgust. She took a step back, examining Lyra as though she were a filthy inconvenience. "Work? You! Look at yourself!" she scoffed, her eyes filled with cold amusement as she continued, "You're dirty. You smell like the streets. And God knows what's crawling in that hair of yours. Why don't you go find a place where you belong, a shelter? An orphanage?" As Lyra clenched her fists, a wave of anger rose inside her. But years on the streets had taught her to swallow that anger, to bury it deep where no one could see. She felt the sting of shame, the bitter reminder of where she stood in the world. She backed away slowly, murmuring under her breath, "You don't know anything about me." The woman raised her eyebrows, her voice dripping with contempt. "Of course I don't. And I don't want to." With a dramatic turn, she strode away, leaving Lyra to stare at her fading figure, a bitter taste of rejection lingering on her tongue. The city lights flickered on, neon signs flashing to life as the sun finally dipped below the horizon. Night was coming, and Lyra knew she needed to find food soon. Hunger clawed at her insides, a constant, unyielding reminder of her place in the city. She began walking, searching the alleys for scraps, her bare feet silent against the damp pavement. As she rounded a corner, the warm, savory smell of food wafted out from behind a luxurious restaurant called the Sterling. Her mouth watered instinctively. She had learned through trial and error that if she approached quietly enough and waited until the staff was busy, she could sometimes scavenge the leftovers they tossed away at the end of a shift. Tonight, she hoped, would be one of those nights. She crouched low, positioning herself behind the overflowing trash bins as she scanned her surroundings. Her eyes caught the movement inside the kitchen as a chef meticulously placed tiny garnishes on a dish, each stroke deliberate and perfect. The sight made her stomach growl audibly, and she winced, patting her stomach to quiet the rumbling. As she watched, a familiar figure walked into the brightly lit kitchen. Grace Vanderbilt. Even Lyra, who spent her days on the street, knew of the Vanderbilts. They were wealth incarnate, lavish lifestyles, luxury cars, and clothes that could buy a family a year's worth of food. Grace was often in the magazines Lyra found discarded on the sidewalk. Her name always tied to grand charity events and social gatherings. But tonight, Grace didn't appear to be the same poised figure Lyra had seen in photographs. There was something in her eyes. A cold calculation. That made Lyra's spine tingle. Grace approached a waiter who was setting the final touches on a plate. Her movements smooth and almost unnoticeable as she pulled a tiny vial from her purse. Lyra's eyes widened, the hairs on her arms standing up as she realized what she was seeing. Grace glanced around quickly, ensuring no one was watching, before tipping the vial and letting a few dark, oily drops fall onto the plated dish. Lyra clamped her hand over her mouth, her heartbeat thundering in her chest as Grace slipped the vial back into her purse. Her face calm, her movements practiced. "Please," Lyra whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "Someone has to see this." She knew that if the dish reached its intended recipient, they would never survive. Lyra had seen poison before, in the hands of other street children who had lost hope and in dangerous strangers who whispered about the powers of darkness. But she had never seen someone so calculated, so ruthless, so untouched by her own intentions. As the waiter picked up the dish, Lyra felt her body move before her mind even registered the thought. She stumbled forward, sprinting toward the restaurant entrance. She didn't know how she would stop them, how she could possibly be believed. But she knew she had to try. With trembling hands, she banged on the restaurant's polished glass doors, her voice rising as she shouted, "Stop! Don't eat that! There's poison! She put poison in it!" The security guard at the entrance, a large, intimidating figure, eyed her with instant suspicion. He stepped forward, blocking her way, his gaze hardening as he took in her disheveled appearance. "Get out of here!" he barked, grabbing her by the arm. "We don't need trouble from beggars tonight." "No! You don't understand," Lyra pleaded, trying to pull free. "She's going to kill him! Please! You have to believe me!" But her words fell on deaf ears. The guard's grip tightened, dragging her away from the doors as her cries echoed through the night. Inside, the waiters bustled about, oblivious to her warnings as they carried the poisoned dish toward the main dining room. Lyra's heart sank as she watched, her voice fading into the city's din. Her last hope vanished as she felt herself pushed into the dark. Rejected, unheard, a mere street child with a warning no one would believe. The city's neon lights shimmered in the restaurant windows, casting a colorful glow over the Sterling's polished glass doors. Lyra's heart pounded as she fought against the security guard's unyielding grip, her voice hoarse and breaking as she shouted, "Please! Someone has to hear me! Don't let him eat that food!" The guard's face remained stony, his grip only tightening as he began to drag her away from the restaurant entrance. "Listen here," he growled, his eyes narrowing. "We don't need your kind here causing a scene. You've got two choices: leave quietly, or I'll call the police." Desperation clawed at Lyra's insides, and for a moment, panic froze her to the spot. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to protect herself from being thrown into a cell or worse. But the image of the woman, Grace Vanderbilt, her calm face as she poured poison onto the dish, seared itself into Lyra's mind. No one would believe her, but she couldn't turn away. She couldn't let a man die simply because she was afraid. Swallowing her fear, she took a deep breath, her voice steadying as she spoke to the guard. "Sir? Please! I saw that woman, she's going to hurt him. There's poison in the food they're bringing to him right now. If you don't let me warn him, he'll die." Her gaze was unwavering, her heart thundering with urgency. But the guard simply rolled his eyes, sneering. "A little beggar girl like you, spinning stories. Get out of here before I toss you into the street myself." Behind her, Lyra could hear the laughter and clinking glasses of the restaurant patrons, oblivious to the danger unfolding just steps away. She craned her neck, catching a glimpse of a waiter entering the dining room, the fatal dish balanced delicately on his tray. Her pulse spiked with fear. Time was running out. Lyra summoned every ounce of courage she had left and twisted sharply, freeing herself from the guard's grip. Before he could react, She darted past him and burst through the restaurant doors. Gasps and startled murmurs erupted around her as she bolted into the lavish dining room, her eyes darting frantically from one table to the next. And then she saw him. Silas Vanderbilt, seated alone at a table draped in pristine white linen, his tailored navy suit sharply contrasting with his surroundings. He was gazing down at his meal with satisfaction, reaching for his fork as he prepared to take his first bite. The dish lay in front of him, the steam curling in delicate wisps, inviting and deadly. "Stop!" Lyra screamed, her voice tearing through the restaurant's elegant ambience like glass shattering on tile. Heads turned, and the chatter died, replaced by stunned silence as she stumbled forward, her dirty hands outstretched. Silas paused, his hand freezing midair as he looked up, surprise and confusion flickering across his face. "What on earth?" he began, his gaze narrowing as he took in the sight of the ragged girl standing in the middle of the fine dining establishment. Before he could finish his sentence, the guard caught up to her, grabbing her roughly by the shoulders. "Get out!" he snarled, his voice filled with contempt. "You're disturbing our guests." But Lyra struggled, her small frame writhing against his grip as she fought to break free. "Please! You have to believe me! Your wife, she poisoned your food! I saw her do it!" Her voice trembled, raw and desperate as she locked eyes with Silas. Silas's face shifted from irritation to mild amusement, then finally to wary concern as he studied her. "My wife! Grace?" he repeated slowly, as if testing the words. A murmur rippled through the surrounding tables as patrons watched the scene unfold, their faces a mixture of curiosity and shock. "She poured something dark onto your food," Lyra insisted, her voice trembling. "I don't know what it was, but I know it was poison." For a moment, Silas hesitated. Something in Lyra's pleading gaze, her unwavering desperation, seemed to reach him. He glanced down at the dish before him, and a flicker of doubt crossed his features. But then he shook his head, his expression hardening. "Enough of this nonsense," he said coolly, waving the waiter forward. "Take this girl out of here. I don't have time for—" But before he could finish, a sickly pallor suddenly washed over his face, and he staggered, clutching his chest. His fork clattered to the table, and his body slumped forward, his breathing shallow and labored. Gasps and murmurs erupted around the room as the diners watched in horror, some covering their mouths in shock. Lyra struggled against the guard's hold, panic filling her voice as she shouted, "He's been poisoned! Please! Someone call an ambulance!" The waiter who had served Silas dropped his tray, his eyes wide as he looked down at the man convulsing in his seat. The room was in chaos, the soft murmur of diners replaced by frantic cries and the scrape of chairs as people rushed to help, or retreated in fear. Silas's face had turned a ghostly shade of gray, beads of sweat glistening on his brow as he gasped for air. His hands shook violently, and his gaze locked onto Lyra's, filled with a mixture of terror and dawning realization. The guard released his hold on Lyra, but only to shove her away from the scene, his face twisted with anger. "You! This is all your fault! You came in here to cause trouble, and look what you've done!" Lyra fell back, barely catching herself on a nearby table. Her heart sank as she realized no one in the room believed her. They all thought she was the one responsible. But there was no time to argue, no time to explain. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Someone call a doctor! He doesn't have much time!" Just then, a woman's voice sliced through the panic like a knife. "What is going on here?" Lyra turned and felt her blood run cold. Standing at the entrance to the dining room was Grace Vanderbilt herself, her eyes sharp and calculating as she surveyed the scene. Her expression was one of concern, but Lyra could see the glint of something darker in her gaze, a flicker of satisfaction that vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "Oh, Silas! My dear!" Grace exclaimed, rushing forward, her hands pressed to her chest in a perfect imitation of distress. She knelt beside him, reaching out a hand to touch his trembling shoulder. "What happened? Who did this?" Silas tried to respond, but his words came out as a weak, gasping whisper. He looked up at Grace. Confusion and pain etched into his features, as if he were trying to make sense of what was happening. She did it, the guard snapped, pointing at Lyra with an accusatory glare. This little beggar came in here screaming about poison. And then this happened. Grace's eyes turned icy as she looked at Lyra, her face a mask of horror and accusation. How could you? She whispered, her voice filled with false disbelief. You came in here to hurt my husband, didn't you? Lyra's chest tightened, her heart pounding as the weight of the accusations fell upon her. She tried to speak, to explain, but her voice was drowned out by the murmurs and whispers of the onlookers, who were all too eager to accept Grace's story over hers. No! I was trying to warn him, Lyra shouted, her voice desperate and breaking. I saw you put something in his food. I was only trying to help. But her words fell on deaf ears. The crowd watched with scornful, skeptical gazes, their judgment written plainly on their faces. Grace took a step back, shaking her head slowly as though she were unable to comprehend Lyra's audacity. You don't belong here, Grace said softly, her voice dripping with contempt. You don't know anything about us. And you've already caused enough damage. Lyra felt herself being yanked backward as the guard grabbed her arm again, hauling her toward the door. Tears burned in her eyes, a mixture of fear, frustration, and helplessness as she was dragged out of the restaurant, her cries fading into the night. As the doors closed behind her, Lyra looked back one last time, catching a final glimpse of Silas lying limp on the floor, his fate now resting in the hands of the very person who had brought him to this moment. Please, she whispered to herself as she was pulled away, her voice barely audible. Someone has to believe me. But the city lights remained silent, casting cold, indifferent shadows across the streets as Lyra disappeared into the night, alone with her truth and the impossible weight of proving it. The night inside the Sterling was nothing short of chaos. Silas lay slumped against the dining table, his body trembling as waves of pain surged through him. The guests, who moments ago had been enjoying a quiet, luxurious meal, now stood around him in shock, their faces a mixture of horror and confusion. Waiters and staff members rushed around, some frantically trying to assist, while others backed away, overwhelmed by the unfolding scene. Grace Vanderbilt knelt beside her husband, her manicured hands resting delicately on his shoulder. Her face was a mask of concern, but her eyes revealed nothing but cold calculation. To anyone watching, she appeared the picture of a distressed, dutiful wife, but to those who knew her well, the slight curve of her lips might have betrayed something darker. Oh, Silas! She cried, her voice filled with faux distress. She reached for his hand, her grip gentle yet firm. What happened? Darling? Please, speak to me. Silas's breaths were shallow, his face pale and slick with sweat. His gaze flickered to Grace, a hint of confusion mingling with the fear in his eyes. He tried to speak, his lips parting, but no words came out, only a faint, ragged whisper. He felt the world tilting around him, the colors fading as his vision blurred. The head waiter, a tall man with a carefully maintained mustache, stepped forward. Someone call an ambulance! He shouted, his voice rising above the panicked murmurs of the other guests. Mr. Vanderbilt needs immediate medical attention. A young woman pulled out her phone, her hands trembling as she dialed emergency services. The crowd began to murmur, and several guests pulled out their phones to film the commotion, drawn by the allure of witnessing a scandal unfold. The cold glow of their screens cast an eerie light over the room, further deepening the sense of unease. Grace shot a glare at the onlookers, her voice sharp. Please! This is a private matter! Stop filming and have some respect. But even as she spoke, her eyes betrayed no true sorrow. She appeared perfectly composed, as though she had rehearsed this moment 100 times. Meanwhile, Silas's breathing grew more erratic. His chest heaved as he gasped for air, his body racked with uncontrollable tremors. He looked up, his gaze unfocused, barely able to register the worried faces around him. In the back of his mind, he could still hear that girl's warning, the desperate voice of the street child who had risked everything to save him. "It was the girl," he rasped, the words barely audible. Grace leaned closer, pretending to comfort him. But her voice was firm and quiet. "Shh, Silas. Don't strain yourself." Her fingers tightened ever so slightly around his hand, the touch almost possessive. To anyone watching, it looked like a comforting gesture. But Silas could feel the strength behind it, a silent warning. "Sir? Can you hear me?" One of the waiters knelt beside him, his voice filled with genuine concern. "Help is on the way. Just hang in there." Silas blinked, trying to focus. But his mind felt like it was drifting away, slipping into a dark void. He was vaguely aware of the sounds around him, the anxious whispers, the faint click of heels against marble, and Grace's calm, steady breathing beside him. His thoughts returned to the girl's face, her wide, terrified eyes as she had screamed, "Don't eat that!" He tried to gather the strength to speak, to warn someone, but his body felt like it was shutting down, piece by piece. A wave of dizziness washed over him, and he felt himself fading, slipping further into darkness. The restaurant's front doors swung open, and 2 paramedics rushed in, carrying a stretcher and a bag of medical equipment. They pushed through the crowd, their faces grim as they assessed the situation. The taller of the 2, a woman with a determined expression, knelt beside Silas, checking his pulse and breathing. "What happened here?" she demanded, glancing up at the head waiter. "We're not entirely sure," he replied, wringing his hands nervously. "1 minute, Mr. Vanderbilt was fine. And the next, he just collapsed." Grace stepped forward, her face carefully composed. "My husband, he's been under a lot of stress lately," she explained, her voice soft and trembling. "Perhaps it's just exhaustion?" The paramedic's gaze lingered on Grace for a moment, her brow furrowing. She nodded curtly, but her focus returned to Silas. "Sir? Can you hear me? Try to stay with us." She gently patted his cheek, but Silas barely responded, his eyelids fluttering as he slipped in and out of consciousness. As they loaded him onto the stretcher, the second paramedic began setting up and for, injecting a clear liquid that would help stabilize him. "We're taking him to St. Mark's Hospital," he announced. "If your family, you can meet us there." Grace nodded, pressing a hand to her chest in a display of worry. "Of course. I'll follow right behind." With Silas securely on the stretcher, the paramedics maneuvered through the crowd, carefully avoiding the tables and chairs in their path. As they reached the door, Grace followed closely, a carefully constructed look of worry etched into her features. But as she glanced back at the dining room, her gaze settled on the lingering guests, her lips curving in a satisfied smirk that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. The paramedics lifted the stretcher into the ambulance, securing Silas as the vehicle doors shut with a loud clang. Grace climbed into her sleek black car, her face composed and serene, but her mind already calculating her next moves. She knew that with Silas out of the picture, her plans would finally fall into place. The ambulance's sirens blared, cutting through the night as they sped toward the hospital, leaving behind the confused and unsettled guests of the Sterling. Inside the ambulance, Silas drifted between moments of consciousness, his mind a blur of fragmented images, the girl's frantic face, Grace's cold stare, the taste of something bitter on his tongue. As the ambulance sped through the city streets, the paramedic beside him leaned closer, her voice soft but insistent. "Stay with us, Mr. Vanderbilt. We're almost there." But Silas's eyes had already closed, his consciousness slipping into a deep, dark void. Back at the Sterling, the guests resumed their seats. Though the earlier charm of the evening had been tainted by the unsettling events, the whispers and murmurs grew louder as patrons discussed the bizarre scene they had just witnessed. "Did you see that street girl?" one man muttered to his companion. "She practically screamed bloody murder." "I know," replied his dinner companion, casting a nervous glance at the door. "Do you think she had something to do with it?" Another woman, who had been silent up until now, shook her head. "I saw her, too. She seemed genuinely terrified. Maybe she was trying to warn him." Her companion scoffed, sipping his wine. Please! What could a girl like that know? She probably just wanted attention or money. In a corner booth, a young waiter listened to the conversation, his face pale and troubled. He had seen Grace Vanderbilt with the dish just moments before it had been served, and something about her had struck him as strange. But he shook his head, telling himself it was nothing more than the imagination of a young man easily intimidated by wealth and status. As the diners slowly resumed their meals, the sense of unease lingered, like a dark cloud hanging over the room. The elegant atmosphere of the Sterling had been shattered, replaced by a tension that couldn't be easily dismissed. Outside, in the alley behind the restaurant, Lyra huddled in the shadows, her face buried in her hands as she fought back tears. She had done everything she could to save Silas, but no one had listened to them. She was just a street girl, a nobody, unworthy of their trust or attention. Please let him survive, she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. Please, let him be okay. But deep down, Lyra knew the odds were against her. She had witnessed the depths of Grace's cruelty, and she knew that the powerful seldom faced justice for their actions. Her heart ached with frustration, a hopelessness settling over her as she sat alone in the darkness. And yet, a flicker of determination stirred within her. She might be small, poor, and dismissed by society, but she knew what she had seen. No matter what it took, she would find a way to make someone believe her. She would make sure the truth came out. As the city lights glowed above, Lyra rose slowly to her feet, her face set with a fierce resolve. She had lost everything before, and she had survived. Now, she would fight for the truth. Not just for herself, but for Silas, the man whose life hung in the balance. With a final glance at the Sterling, Lyra turned and disappeared into the night, her mind already forming a plan, her heart hardened by the trials she knew were yet to come. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered overhead as Lyra sat there shivering, on a cold metal chair in a stark interrogation room at the local police station. Her wrists, still marked by the guard's rough handling, ached as she clasped her hands tightly in her lap. She glanced around, trying to steady her breathing, but the imposing walls and echoing silence made her feel small, helpless, like prey trapped in a cage. A detective entered the room, his heavy footsteps reverberating as he set a clipboard on the table with a loud slap. He was an older man, his gray hair combed back and his expression stern, lined with years of dealing with hardened criminals. He stared at her, a hint of irritation flickering across his face as if this were a waste of his time. All right, young lady, he began, his voice low and gravelly. Let's start from the beginning. Why were you in the Sterling tonight? Lyra swallowed hard, her voice coming out in a shaky whisper. I was trying to warn him. I saw his wife put something in his food. Poison. The detective raised an eyebrow, his lips twisting into a skeptical smirk. Poison? You're telling me that Grace Vanderbilt, one of the city's most well-known socialites, tried to poison her own husband? And only you, a street girl, saw this? He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms as he looked her up and down. Lyra met his gaze, trying to stay strong, but the disbelief in his eyes chipped away at her courage. It's the truth, she insisted, her voice growing stronger. She poured something dark onto his plate, right before the waiter served it. I tried to warn him, but nobody would listen. The detective sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose in frustration. Let me get this straight. You just happened to be lurking outside a high-end restaurant, and you just happened to see Mrs. Vanderbilt, one of the city's wealthiest women, trying to kill her husband? Forgive me if I find that a little hard to believe. Lyra's hands clenched into fists. She could feel the frustration building inside her, anger mixing with helplessness as she tried to make him understand. I was there because I was looking for food. I don't have a home or money. I just wanted something to eat. But when I saw what she was doing, I knew I had to try to stop it. I couldn't just let him die. The detective's gaze hardened, and he leaned forward, his face only inches from hers. Listen here, kid. People like you have a habit of spinning stories to get what you want. You want us to believe that you, a homeless street rat, were just trying to be a hero? His words cut deep, and Lyra felt her cheeks flush with shame. But she refused to back down. I don't care what you believe, she said, her voice shaking with emotion. It's the truth. She poisoned him. And now he's in the hospital, fighting for his life. The detective rolled his eyes, his expression one of contempt. Do you have any proof? Any evidence to back up this little fairy tale of yours? Lyra's heart sank. She had nothing, no proof. No way to make them believe her. All she had was her word. And she could see now just how little that meant in a place like this. She was just a street girl. A nobody. Why would anyone take her word over that of Grace Vanderbilt? The door opened, and in walked another officer, holding a small stack of papers. He handed them to the detective, who flipped through them before smirking and shaking his head. Looks like you have quite a reputation, kid, he said, holding up one of the papers. Caught loitering, trespassing, and oh, look at that, accused of petty theft from a restaurant just last month. Seems like you have a habit of showing up where you're not wanted. Lyra's eyes widened as she shook her head vigorously. No, I didn't steal anything. I only ever look for food in the trash. I never hurt anyone. The detective chuckled, clearly unconvinced. Sure, that's what they all say. But here you are again, causing trouble. And this time, we've got a witness who claims you tried to harm one of the city's most prominent businessmen. Lyra's heart pounded as she realized who the witness must be. Grace. Grace had twisted the truth, turned everyone against her with just a few simple words. The weight of the injustice crushed her, and she felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. But she blinked them back, determined not to let them see her cry. Please, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm telling the truth. You have to believe me. The detective shook his head, his expression cold and unyielding. I don't have to believe anything. Kid, you're just another troublemaker trying to get attention. Lyra felt her spirit crumble. The flicker of hope that someone might believe her snuffed out in an instant. She was alone. Truly and completely alone. Her voice, her truth, none of it mattered in the face of wealth and power. As she sat there in silence, the door opened once again, and in stepped Grace Vanderbilt herself. She was dressed impeccably, her expression somber yet dignified as she looked around the room. Her eyes settled on Lyra, and a faint, almost imperceptible smirk played at the corners of her lips before she quickly replaced it with an expression of concern. Oh, detective, she began, her voice soft and measured, like a woman carrying the weight of unimaginable grief. I came as soon as I heard. I wanted to make sure that justice is served. She cast a sidelong glance at Lyra, her eyes glinting with a predatory gleam. The detective straightened, giving Grace a respectful nod. Mrs. Vanderbilt, we're doing everything we can to get to the bottom of this. Grace placed a delicate hand over her chest, exuding an air of wounded innocence. This girl, she's dangerous. She barged into the restaurant, screaming, causing a scene, and then, somehow, my poor husband ends up in critical condition? I don't want to believe it, detective. But it seems she's responsible. Lyra's mouth fell open in shock, her mind reeling. No! You're lying! I was trying to warn him. To save him. But Grace only sighed, shaking her head with a look of pity. I know it's hard, dear. Life on the streets can be cruel. But that's no excuse for trying to hurt someone. The detective nodded, seeming to take Grace's words as truth without a second thought. Don't worry, Mrs. Vanderbilt. We'll make sure she's dealt with. Lyra felt a surge of panic rise in her chest. She had to do something, anything, to make them see the truth. Ask the waiters. The cooks. They must have seen her in the kitchen, putting something on his food, she cried, her voice frantic. But the detective merely shook his head. Enough. Kid, you're done here. Grace stepped forward, a look of false sympathy on her face. It's all right, detective. I don't want to press charges, not unless you find it necessary. I'm sure she just needs help. She cast a pointed glance at Lyra. Her gaze filled with a cold, silent threat. The detective sighed, rubbing his temple. Well, Mrs. Vanderbilt, let's just say this young lady is going to spend the night in a holding cell. Maybe that'll give her some time to rethink her story. Lyra's heart plummeted as the reality of her situation set in. No one was going to believe her. She was going to be locked away, treated like a criminal, while the real danger walked free. The officers led her out of the interrogation room, their grips firm as they marched her down a dimly lit corridor. She barely heard their voices, barely registered the cold steel of the cell as they locked her inside. All she could think about was the injustice, the overwhelming unfairness of it all. As she sat down on the cold, hard bench, a single tear slipped down her cheek. She had tried. She had done everything she could to save a man's life. But it hadn't been enough. And now, she was paying the price for telling the truth. But even as despair washed over her, a flicker of resolve sparked within her. She couldn't give up. Silas's life hung in the balance. And as long as she was still breathing, there was a chance, however slim, that she could make someone believe her. Curling up on the bench, Lyra closed her eyes, steeling herself for what lay ahead. She was just a street kid, a nobody. But she had the truth on her side. And somehow, someway, she would find a way to make it known. The sharp, antiseptic smell of the hospital greeted Silas as he slowly drifted back to consciousness. His body felt heavy, weighed down by a lethargy he couldn't shake. His eyelids fluttered open, revealing a blurry ceiling above him, bathed in the soft glow of fluorescent lights. For a moment, he didn't know where he was or how he had come to be there. His mind felt clouded, thick with a confusion that made it hard to think. Gradually, memories began to resurface. He remembered sitting at a table in the Sterling, the aroma of an exquisite dish drifting toward him. Then, the flash of a small, frightened face, the street girl who had burst into the dining room, shouting warnings. He had brushed her off, dismissing her as a nuisance, just as Grace had told him to. But then, the pain. It was unlike anything he had ever felt before, a searing ache that had spread from his stomach, robbing him of his breath. He had looked into Grace's face, hoping for comfort, for answers. But her expression had been a mask, her eyes cold and calculating. He shuddered now, even in the hospital bed, remembering the icy indifference he had seen in her gaze. A faint beeping sound drew his attention, and he noticed the machines around him, wires and tubes connecting him to monitors that recorded his heartbeat, his breathing, every fragile sign of life. He tried to lift his hand, but even the smallest movement sent a wave of exhaustion through him. The door opened, and a nurse entered, her expression softening as she saw him awake. "Mr. Vanderbilt," she said gently, approaching his bedside. "How are you feeling? You've been through quite an ordeal." Silas's throat was dry, and when he tried to speak, his voice came out as a hoarse whisper. "What happened?" The nurse adjusted the fluoride drip beside his bed, glancing at the monitors. "You were poisoned, sir. We're still running tests to determine exactly what substance was used. But you were in critical condition when you arrived. It's a miracle you pulled through." Poisoned. The word echoed in Silas's mind, chilling him to the core. The memories became clearer now, sharper, each detail falling into place like pieces of a puzzle. The girl's face, her desperate eyes, the way she had shouted that there was poison in his food, and Grace, his wife, kneeling beside him as he collapsed, her face serene, almost satisfied. He struggled to process it all, to understand how this could be true. But deep down, in a place he had always tried to ignore, a truth he had long denied began to surface. There was a knock on the door, and a doctor entered, clipboard in hand. He was a tall man with graying hair, his expression both professional and compassionate. "Mr. Vanderbilt, it's good to see you awake," the doctor said, nodding to the nurse, who stepped back to give them space. "You're lucky to be alive. The poison you ingested was potent, but you responded well to the treatment." Silas swallowed, his mouth dry as he struggled to find the right words. There was a girl. She tried to warn me. The doctor exchanged a glance with the nurse, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Girl? I'm afraid there's no record of anyone visiting you before you were brought in. Aside from Mrs. Vanderbilt. No, Silas said, his voice firmer. There was a young girl. She came into the restaurant. She said something about poison, about Grace. His chest tightened as he said his wife's name, the realization settling over him like a heavy shroud. The doctor's expression remained cautious. Mr. Vanderbilt, you've been through a traumatic event. Sometimes the mind fills in gaps with things that aren't there. But Silas knew he hadn't imagined it. He could still see her face, hear her voice. I need to find her. She knew what was happening. She might know who did this. The doctor hesitated, clearly unsure of how to proceed. Perhaps, once you've recovered a bit more. For now, it's important that you focus on resting. You're still weak, and you'll need time to regain your strength. Silas's frustration simmered beneath the surface. But he knew he had no choice. His body was too frail, his energy depleted. He leaned back against the pillows, nodding reluctantly. Fine. But when I'm better, I want to speak with the police. The doctor nodded. Of course, Mr. Vanderbilt. We'll make the necessary arrangements. The nurse adjusted his blankets, her expression kind but distant, as though she too doubted his story. They left the room, the door closing softly behind them, leaving Silas alone with his thoughts. He closed his eyes, trying to rest, but his mind wouldn't allow him peace. The image of Grace's face lingered, her cold smile as she knelt beside him. He felt a pang of betrayal so deep it twisted in his chest. How could the woman he had trusted, loved, have done this to him? And the girl, the street girl who had warned him. He had dismissed her, thinking her words were nonsense. But she had been right. She had risked everything to save him, while his own wife had tried to kill him. A fierce resolve grew within him, filling him with a strength he hadn't felt in years. As soon as he was able, he would find her. He would make sure the truth came to light, no matter the cost. Grace would face justice for what she had done. Hours passed, marked only by the quiet hum of machines and the steady beep of the monitors beside him. The hospital staff came and went, checking his vitals, adjusting his medication. But he barely registered their presence. His mind was fixed on one thought: he had to find the girl. She was his only connection to the truth, the only witness to Grace's treachery. Days went by, his strength gradually returning with each passing hour. He practiced sitting up, moving his arms, forcing his body to regain its mobility. The nurses praised his progress, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Every morning, he asked about the girl, and every morning, he was met with the same skeptical looks, the same doubt. But Silas refused to be deterred. He knew what he had seen. He remembered her face as clearly as if she were standing beside him. Finally, after a week of recovery, the day came when he was deemed well enough to leave the hospital. The doctor reviewed his chart, giving him strict instructions to rest and take his medications. But Silas barely listened, his mind already set on the task ahead. As he left the hospital, he instructed his driver to take him to the Sterling. The ride felt endless, each minute stretching out as he sat in silence, his resolve hardening with every passing second. He would find the girl, and if no one else would listen, he would make them believe her. When they arrived, he stepped out of the car, ignoring the familiar faces of the restaurant staff who greeted him with shock and murmurs of sympathy. He didn't stop to answer their questions, didn't pause to explain. Instead, he went around to the alley behind the restaurant, the place where he hoped she might be. He scanned the shadows, searching for any sign of her, his heart pounding with anticipation and dread. Then, from the far corner of the alley, he heard a faint rustling sound, the scrape of shoes against pavement. "Please, just a little food," a small voice muttered, barely audible over the distant hum of the city. Silas turned, his gaze settling on the figure crouched by the trash bins. She was even smaller than he remembered. her thin frame hunched over as she rummaged through the discarded leftovers. Her face was gaunt, her clothes torn, but there was no mistaking her. "Lyra!" he called softly, not wanting to frighten her. The girl froze, her hand hovering over a crumpled sandwich as she looked up. Her eyes widened with shock, and for a moment, she looked ready to bolt, to disappear into the shadows. But then recognition dawned in her gaze, and she stayed rooted to the spot, staring at him in disbelief. "Mr. Vanderbilt, you're alive?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Silas stepped closer, his expression softening as he looked at her. The girl who had saved him. "Yes. Thanks to you," he said, his voice filled with quiet gratitude. "You tried to warn me, and I didn't listen. I'm sorry." Lyra's face crumpled, a mixture of relief and fear flickering in her eyes. They didn't believe me," she stammered. "They thought I did it. They arrested me." A surge of anger burned in Silas's chest as he realized the extent of the injustice she had endured. This girl had risked everything to save him, and she had been punished for it. "Well, they're going to listen now," he said firmly, reaching out a hand. "Come with me, Lyra. We'll make sure everyone knows the truth." Lyra hesitated, glancing down at his outstretched hand. She had been lied to, ignored, and mistreated her whole life, and trust didn't come easily. But as she looked into Silas's eyes, she saw something she had rarely seen before, a promise, a genuine kindness that she hadn't known in years. Slowly, she took his hand, her fingers trembling as she allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that maybe this time, things would be different. As they left the alley together, Lyra felt a flicker of hope reignite within her. She had finally found someone who believed her, someone who would stand by her side. And as long as Silas was with her, she knew they had a chance to bring the truth to light. Together, they walked into the night, a powerful alliance formed out of trust, determination, and the unwavering belief in justice. Lyra sat stiffly in the back seat of Silas's car, her fingers nervously clutching the hem of her ragged shirt. She glanced around at the plush leather seats, the spotless windows, and the gentle hum of the engine. It felt surreal to be there, as if she had stepped into a different world, a world she had only seen from a distance. Silas sat beside her, his gaze steady and thoughtful as he studied her. He could see the apprehension in her eyes, the way she held herself as if ready to bolt at any moment. He wanted to reach out, to reassure her, but he knew he needed to tread carefully. This girl had spent her life on the streets, and trust wasn't something she would offer easily. "Thank you for coming with me, Lyra," he said gently, breaking the silence. "I know this must be overwhelming." She nodded, her eyes fixed on her lap. I didn't know what else to do. They wouldn't believe me about your wife." Silas felt a pang of anger at the thought of Grace, at the way she had tried to turn everyone against Lyra. "They will now," he said firmly. "You did the right thing, Lyra. You tried to warn me when no one else would." Lyra looked up, her eyes searching his face for any hint of doubt. But all she saw was sincerity, a quiet gratitude that made her chest tighten. She had been ignored, dismissed, and treated like a criminal. But here was a man who was finally listening. Silas's driver took them to his penthouse, an expansive apartment that overlooked the city. As they stepped inside, Lyra's eyes widened, taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows, the elegant furniture, and the soft glow of the lights. She had never seen anything like it. This is your home?" she whispered, unable to hide her amazement. Silas nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Yes. It's not much. But," he hesitated, noticing the way she gazed around, a mixture of awe and disbelief on her face. "Not much?" she repeated, almost laughing at the understatement. To her, this place was a palace, a world away from the cold, hard streets she had grown up on. She felt out of place, a piece of dirt in a spotless room. But Silas's expression softened as he watched her, as if he could sense her discomfort. "You're safe here, Lyra," he said gently. You're welcome to stay as long as you need. The kindness in his voice made her heart twist. She had spent so long relying on herself, never allowing herself to hope for anything more. But here, in this warm, unfamiliar place, she felt the faint stirrings of hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, she had finally found someone who would stand by her. Silas led her to the living room, where he motioned for her to sit down. She perched on the edge of the sofa, her posture rigid as she glanced around, her gaze drifting to a painting on the wall. It depicted a landscape, a peaceful scene of rolling hills and a quiet river winding through a forest. She found herself staring at it, lost in the serenity of the image. After a moment, Silas sat across from her, his expression serious. "Lyra, I need to know everything you saw that night," he said. "Every detail, no matter how small. It's the only way we'll be able to prove the truth." Lyra nodded slowly, gathering her thoughts. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the quiet urgency in his voice. Taking a deep breath, she began to recount the events of that night, her voice steady but soft. "I was out behind the Sterling, looking for food," she began. "It's a good place to find leftovers, usually. I was about to leave when I saw her, your wife. She was in the kitchen, near one of the chefs. At first, I thought she was just, checking on the food. But then I saw her take out this little glass bottle. It was dark. Like something dangerous." She glanced up, gauging Silas's reaction. He nodded, urging her to continue. "She waited until no one was looking," Lyra continued, her voice growing stronger as the memory became clearer. "Then she tipped the bottle and poured something onto the dish they were preparing for you. It was dark and oily, like poison. I knew it wasn't right. I knew. I had to stop it." A flicker of pain crossed Silas's face as he listened, his fist clenching slightly. He had known Grace for years, had trusted her with his life. To think that she had betrayed him in such a cruel, calculated way felt like a knife twisting in his heart. "And you tried to warn me," he said softly, his voice filled with regret. Lyra nodded, her eyes filled with frustration. "I tried. But no one listened. They all thought I was lying, that I was trying to cause trouble." Her hands tightened into fists, her voice trembling with anger and pain. "They dragged me away, called me a criminal. And she just stood there, watching. She knew no one would believe me." Silas's expression hardened, his jaw set in determination. "Well, I believe you, Lyra. And now, it's time to make them listen." He reached for his phone, dialing a number with a sense of purpose. "I have a friend in the police department," he explained. "Detective Harper. He's one of the few people I trust to get to the truth." Lyra watched him, a flicker of hope sparking in her chest. She had spent so long being ignored. But now, with Silas by her side, she felt a glimmer of belief that the truth might finally come to light. The phone rang a few times before a deep, steady voice answered. "Detective Harper." "Chris. It's Silas," he said, his voice tense. "I need to talk to you. It's about Grace, and the incident at the Sterling." There was a pause on the other end, and then Detective Harper's voice took on a serious tone. "What do you mean?" Silas glanced at Lyra, his expression resolute. "There's more to it than what you've heard. Grace, she tried to kill me. And there's someone here who can prove it." He motioned for Lyra to sit closer, holding the phone between them. Detective Harper listened as she recounted her story once more, this time to someone who might finally believe her. She told him about the poison, about her attempts to warn Silas, about the way Grace had twisted the truth and made everyone believe that she was the culprit. When she finished, there was a heavy silence on the other end of the line. "Silas," Detective Harper said finally, his tone cautious but intrigued. "This is a serious accusation. Are you certain about this?" "Yes," Silas replied without hesitation. "I trust her. And I need your help to prove it." Another pause, and then Harper's voice softened. "All right. I'll look into it. But you both need to be prepared. Grace has powerful friends. And she won't go down without a fight. Silas nodded, a spark of determination in his eyes. I understand. Thank you, Chris. They hung up, and Lyra felt a surge of relief wash over her. For the first time, someone had listened, had taken her words seriously. But beneath the relief, a simmering fear lingered. She knew Grace would retaliate, would stop at nothing to protect herself. Silas must have sensed her worry because he reached over, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You're not alone in this, Lyra, he said gently. I'll make sure you're protected. She looked up at him, the warmth in his gaze steadying her nerves. She had always been alone, always relied on herself. But now, with Silas beside her, she felt a strange comfort, a sense of safety she had almost forgotten existed. As the evening wore on, they talked about what lay ahead, the evidence they needed, the people who might come forward, the ways they could expose Grace's lies. Silas explained the legal process, the steps they would take, and how he would be by her side every step of the way. By the time night had fully fallen, Lyra felt a flicker of hope she hadn't dared to feel before. She looked out at the city lights, twinkling like stars against the dark sky. This was the beginning of something new, something she had never thought possible. As she prepared to sleep in the guest room Silas had offered her, she felt a warmth she hadn't known in years, a sense of belonging, of purpose. She was no longer a nameless street girl, a voice lost in the noise. She was part of something bigger, part of a fight for truth and justice. And with Silas by her side, she felt stronger than she ever had. She knew they had a long road ahead, filled with obstacles and danger. But for the first time in her life, she believed that they could win. In the quiet darkness of the room, Lyra closed her eyes, allowing herself to dream of a future where she was heard, where justice prevailed, and where she finally found a place to belong. The courthouse buzzed with quiet anticipation as reporters, spectators, and curious onlookers gathered, filling every available seat. The case of Silas Vanderbilt, a prominent businessman almost fatally poisoned, and the accusations against his wife, Grace Vanderbilt, had captured the city's attention. The public was captivated by the idea that the glamorous Grace might have orchestrated such a sinister plot. And today, for the first time, she would face trial. Lyra sat beside Silas in the front row of the courtroom, her heart pounding as she scanned the crowded room. She felt small and out of place among the formally dressed attorneys, the solemn judge, and the well-to-do spectators. But Silas's steady presence beside her reassured her. He gave her a gentle nod, a silent promise that he was there, that he believed in her. At the front of the room, Grace Vanderbilt sat poised and impeccably dressed, her expression a mask of serenity. Her dark hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, and her hands rested delicately on her lap. She appeared calm, unruffled, as if she were attending a social event rather than standing trial for attempted murder. But when her eyes met Lyra's across the room, a glint of cold malice flickered in her gaze, a silent reminder that she was still dangerous. The judge entered, and everyone rose, a hush falling over the room. After the preliminary proceedings, the prosecutor rose, her eyes sharp as she began to present the case. Her voice echoed through the courtroom as she laid out the facts: Silas's near-fatal poisoning, the unusual behavior of his wife, and the brave intervention of a young girl who had witnessed everything. Our case rests on the courage and testimony of Lyra Hastings, the prosecutor said, gesturing to where Lyra sat, a young woman who, despite having no stake in this, risked everything to warn Mr. Vanderbilt of the imminent danger to his life. Her bravery has brought us to the truth we seek today. Lyra felt her cheeks flush as everyone turned to look at her, their expressions a mix of admiration and curiosity. She shifted in her seat, suddenly feeling exposed. But when she looked over at Silas, his calm, reassuring smile bolstered her confidence. The prosecutor called her to the stand, and Lyra's heart pounded as she walked to the front of the room. Taking her seat in the witness box, she glanced around, taking a deep breath as she steadied herself. This was her moment, the chance to finally tell her story and make people believe her. Miss Hastings, the prosecutor began, her voice gentle but firm. Please tell the court what you witnessed on the night in question. Lyra's throat felt dry. But she forced herself to speak clearly, recounting everything she had seen, the way Grace had slipped into the kitchen, the vial of dark liquid she had poured onto the dish meant for Silas, and her desperate attempt to warn him. As she spoke, her voice grew stronger, fueled by the memory of that night and the fear she had felt. She glanced at the jury, hoping to see a glimmer of understanding in their eyes. Some looked at her with skepticism, but others nodded, their expressions softening as they listened. She could feel the weight of their judgment, and it terrified her. But she pressed on, determined to make them see the truth. When she finished, the prosecutor nodded, her expression approving. Thank you, Miss Hastings. You've shown great courage in coming forward. Now, please tell the court how you were treated after you tried to warn Mr. Vanderbilt. Lyra's hands clenched in her lap, the memories flooding back. No one believed me. They thought I was trying to harm him. They called me a criminal, dragged me away. And Grace, she just stood there, watching. She made them believe it was my fault. Her voice cracked, and she fought to keep her composure. The prosecutor gave her a sympathetic nod, allowing her a moment to collect herself. Miss Hastings, she continued, her tone grave. Did anyone listen to you that night? Did anyone believe your story? Lyra shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. No. Not until Mr. Vanderbilt found me. He's the only one who believed me. The prosecutor smiled, casting a glance at Silas. Thank you, Lyra. No further questions. As she stepped down, Lyra caught Grace's eye. There was a flash of anger in her gaze, a silent promise of retribution. But Lyra held her ground, refusing to look away. She had come this far, and she wouldn't let Grace intimidate her now. The defense attorney rose, a tall, sleek man with a well-practiced air of confidence. He approached Lyra, his expression one of calculated skepticism. Miss Hastings, he began smoothly. You say you saw my client, Grace Vanderbilt, in the kitchen of the Sterling. Do you often find yourself lurking outside high-end restaurants? Lyra's stomach twisted, but she lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated. I wasn't lurking. I was looking for food. The attorney raised an eyebrow, his tone dripping with disdain. Ah, yes. Looking for food. And would you say you often see things when you're looking for food? She could feel the weight of the jury's gaze, the murmurs of doubt rippling through the room. But she forced herself to stay calm, to focus on the truth. I saw what I saw, and I tried to warn him. The attorney smirked, glancing at the jury as if to invite them to share in his amusement. Isn't it possible, Miss Hastings, that you simply imagined seeing something that wasn't there? After all, it's hard to believe someone like you could understand what you were looking at. Anger flared within her, and she clenched her fists, fighting the urge to shout. But she remembered Silas's words, his encouragement to stay strong. She took a deep breath, her voice steady as she replied, No, I didn't imagine it. I know what I saw. The attorney's smile faded, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. He knew he hadn't shaken her. Very well, he said, dismissively. No further questions. Lyra returned to her seat beside Silas, her heart racing as the defense called Grace to the stand. The room fell silent as she took her place, every eye fixed on her. She looked poised, composed, her expression one of quiet sorrow. Mrs. Vanderbilt, the defense attorney began, his voice filled with respect. Please tell the court your version of events on the night of the incident. Grace sighed, her gaze cast down as if in regret. It's difficult to remember every detail, she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. But I remember my husband looking pale, unwell. I was frightened. And I didn't know what to do. Her voice caught, and she looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. The jury leaned forward, captivated by her performance. As she cast herself as the wrong, grieving wife, she glanced at Lyra, her expression one of practiced pity. I saw this girl that night, she continued, her voice dripping with feigned concern. She was causing a scene. Shouting. I thought perhaps she was trying to rob him. Lyra felt her chest tighten as Grace twisted the story, casting herself as the victim, as if she had been trying to protect Silas. But she held her ground, determined not to let Grace's lies rattle her. The defense attorney nodded, his tone sympathetic. Thank you, Mrs. Vanderbilt. You've been very brave. The prosecutor's turn came, her eyes sharp as she approached Grace. Mrs. Vanderbilt, she began, her tone cold. We've heard testimony from a witness who saw you pour a substance onto your husband's food. Can you explain that? Grace's eyes widened, a hint of panic flickering in her gaze. But she quickly masked it, her voice calm as she replied. Of course. It was a simple misunderstanding. I was merely adding seasoning. I had noticed the chef forgot to add it, and I thought I'd help. I would never hurt my husband. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow, her gaze piercing. Interesting. And how do you explain the vial found in your possession? The vial containing a substance that matched the poison in your husband's system? Grace's composure slipped for a fraction of a second, her hands tightening in her lap. I don't know how that got there. It's possible someone planted it to frame me. The prosecutor didn't look convinced. So, let me get this straight. You're suggesting that someone planted poison on you and that the sole witness to the poisoning just happened to be lying? Grace's silence spoke volumes, and a murmur rippled through the courtroom. Lyra felt a glimmer of hope, finally. People were beginning to doubt her. In the days that followed, witness after witness came forward, each one adding a piece to the puzzle that painted Grace in a darker light. Former employees testified about her cruelty, her manipulations, her obsession with control. And finally, the jury began to see the woman behind the mask, the woman who would stop at nothing to get what she wanted. The trial stretched on, tension building with each new revelation. By the end, Grace's once flawless reputation lay in tatters, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. And when the judge finally called for closing arguments, Lyra could feel the shift in the room. The way the jury looked at Grace with disdain, not sympathy. The prosecutor's closing statement was short but powerful. This case is about justice. Justice for a man who was betrayed by the person he trusted most. And justice for a brave young girl who risked everything to tell the truth. I urge you to look past the glamour, the wealth, and the lies, and see the truth that lies beneath. The jury deliberated for hours, each minute stretching out painfully. But when they returned, their faces grim and resolute, Lyra's heart skipped a beat. The foreman rose, reading the verdict. On the charge of attempted murder, we find the defendant, Grace Vanderbilt, guilty. A murmur of relief and satisfaction swept through the room as Grace's face contorted in shock and fury. She stood, her composure shattered, her eyes blazing as she looked at Lyra with pure hatred. But Lyra met her gaze, unflinching, feeling a strength she hadn't known before. The judge's gavel struck, sealing Grace's fate. She was led out of the courtroom, her once proud figure now slumped, defeated. Silas placed a hand on Lyra's shoulder, his voice soft but filled with gratitude. You did it, Lyra. You made them see the truth. Lyra felt a swell of pride, a weight lifting from her chest. She had done it. She had been heard. And as they left the courtroom, the sunlight streaming down on them, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, hope. Together, she and Silas walked out into a new world, one where justice had finally prevailed, and a future that promised possibilities she had never dared to dream. The trial had ended, and with it, the tumultuous chapter of betrayal and danger that had shadowed both Silas and Lyra's lives. Now, as they left the courthouse together, Lyra felt the weight of relief settle over her, a sensation so unfamiliar she hardly knew what to do with it. Silas's steady presence beside her reminded her that this new world was real, that she was truly free from Grace's vengeance. Days passed in a blur of change and newfound purpose. Silas, still recuperating from the effects of the poisoning, spent most of his time at home, surrounded by staff and friends who visited, offering their congratulations for the trial's outcome. But his moments with Lyra were what he valued most. Her courage and resilience had brought them both through a dark journey. And as he looked at her, he saw more than just the young girl who had saved his life. He saw someone he now regarded as family. One crisp autumn morning, Silas called Lyra into his study. A warm, sunlit room lined with bookshelves and a large desk by the window that overlooked the city. Lyra took a hesitant step inside, her gaze drifting over the rich leather-bound books and the paintings on the walls. This room was a world away from the life she had known on the streets. "Come in, Lyra," Silas said gently, motioning her toward a chair opposite his desk. "There's something I'd like to talk to you about." She sat down, her hands folded in her lap. Waiting. She trusted Silas. But a part of her still held on to the wariness that life on the streets had instilled in her. Silas leaned forward, his expression warm yet serious. "I've been thinking about your future," he began. "You've endured so much, Lyra. And you've shown strength and bravery that few people possess. I want to help you build a new life. One that gives you the opportunities you deserve." Lyra's heart raced, and she stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. A new life? For so long, survival had been her only goal. The idea of a future filled with possibilities was overwhelming. "Mr. Vanderbilt," she began. But he held up a hand, smiling. "You don't have to call me that anymore," he said with a chuckle. "I'd like you to call me Silas. Or, if you're comfortable, you can call me Dad." Lyra's eyes widened, and a lump formed in her throat. She hadn't had a family in so long, the concept felt distant, almost foreign. But as she looked at Silas, she saw kindness and understanding in his eyes, a warmth that made her want to trust, to believe in this new beginning. "Silas," she said softly, testing the name. A small smile tugged at her lips, and for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a life beyond survival. Silas continued, his tone thoughtful. "I've arranged for you to attend school, Lyra. A place where you can learn, grow, and pursue whatever dreams you might have. It won't be easy, but I'll be here to support you every step of the way." Lyra's head spun. School had always been a distant dream, something other kids experienced while she scavenged for food, sleeping under bridges or in alleyways. "School? I don't know anything about school," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "You'll learn," Silas assured her, his smile kind. "And you'll have the help and support you need. You're more than capable, Lyra. You've survived things that would break most people." She took a deep breath, nodding slowly as the reality of his words began to sink in. The idea of school, of sitting in a classroom, learning and studying like other kids, seemed surreal. But it was a chance she never thought she'd have, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. Days turned into weeks, and with Silas's guidance, Lyra began to adjust to her new life. He hired a tutor to help her catch up on her studies before starting at a formal school, and Lyra threw herself into her lessons with a fierce determination. She struggled at first, learning to read, to write, to understand things that had once been foreign concepts, but she persevered, her resilience carrying her through each challenge. Silas watched her progress with pride, marveling at her tenacity. She approached her studies with the same courage she had shown throughout the trial, tackling each lesson with a seriousness that belied her young age. In moments of frustration, when the work seemed too difficult, she would glance up and see Silas's encouraging smile, a silent reminder that she was not alone. But it wasn't just academics that Lyra learned. Silas introduced her to art, to music, and to the world of literature that filled his study. She discovered a love for painting, spending hours with a set of watercolors Silas had given her, capturing scenes of the city, memories from her past, and dreams of her future. One evening, as Lyra worked on a painting, Silas entered the room, admiring her work. She was painting a cityscape, the lights of the buildings casting a warm glow against the night sky. Her strokes were careful, deliberate, capturing the vibrancy of the city she had once called home, but from a new perspective. "That's beautiful, Lyra," Silas said, his voice filled with admiration. She looked up, a hint of pride in her expression. It's the city. The way I used to see it. But now, I see it differently. Silas nodded, understanding the unspoken meaning behind her words. You've come so far, Lyra, and I have no doubt you'll go even further. They fell into a comfortable silence, both of them gazing at the painting, lost in thought. Silas felt a surge of gratitude for the journey that had brought them together. A path filled with pain but also with growth and healing. A few months later, Lyra officially began attending school, a milestone that both excited and terrified her. She worried about fitting in, about being different from the other students. But with Silas's encouragement, she found the strength to face each day, embracing the challenges and new experiences that came her way. As the weeks passed, Lyra settled into her new life, finding friends among her classmates and discovering passions she hadn't known she possessed. She joined the art club, where she could share her love for painting with others, and she began to dream of a future where she could use her art to tell her story. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Silas handed her a small, wrapped box. She looked at him in surprise, her eyebrows raising. "What's this?" she asked, a smile playing at her lips. "Open it and see," he replied, a twinkle in his eye. She carefully unwrapped the box, revealing a leather-bound sketchbook and a set of professional watercolor pencils. She ran her fingers over the cover, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I thought you might like something special to keep all your work in," Silas said, watching her reaction. "A place for your art, your memories, and anything else you want to create." Lyra looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Thank you, Silas. I don't know how to thank you for everything." He placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression warm. "You don't have to thank me, Lyra. You've given me something far more valuable than you realize. You saved my life, and you've filled this home with hope." Lyra hugged the sketchbook to her chest, a smile spreading across her face. She felt a warmth, a joy she hadn't known before. This was her family, her home, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly at peace. As time went on, Lyra and Silas continued to support one another, building a bond that grew stronger with each passing day. They talked often about the journey that had brought them together, about the hardships and the triumphs, and Lyra learned to see her past not as something to be ashamed of, but as a part of the strength that had shaped her. Years later, Lyra's art would become known throughout the city, a powerful voice in paintings that captured the resilience and beauty of those who had been forgotten, overlooked, just as she had once been. And each time she painted, each time she held a brush in her hand, she remembered the man who had believed in her, who had given her a chance to rewrite her story. Together, they had faced darkness, injustice, and loss, but they had emerged stronger, bound by a love that had turned strangers into family. And as Lyra looked out over the city from the window of their home, she knew that this was only the beginning. With her art, her newfound family, and her unbreakable spirit, she was ready to face whatever lay ahead, confident that she was no longer alone, and that her story was just beginning.